Discovering Kazakhstan is Dennis Keen's biased view on culture and the modern life of Kazakh people. Amazing landscapes and architectural masterpieces all over Kazakhstan.
Salam, привет, and hello. I'm Dennis Keen, and today on Discovering Kazakhstan, we're in the western city of Uralsk, not far from the border of Russia. Uralsk is a small city that's famous for two historical figures whose last names both happen to start with the letters P-U, Emelian Pugachev and Alexander Pushkin. Pugachev was a one-of-a-kind character who started a peasant rebellion against the Russian Empire from this very place. And Pushkin was a poet who came here and used these events as inspiration for one of his most famous stories. This Russian imperial history continues to be one of Uralsk's most proudest moments. And today, we'd like you to join us as we dive in and learn more about it. In the history of the Russian Empire, one of the most important figures was the samozvanets, or imposter. This was before the age of visual media, so you could pretty much just choose any famous person and pretend to be them, and people might take the bait. After all, they just didn't know any better. This Pugachev was one of these imposters. When Catherine the Great's husband, Peter III, was killed, tons of imposters popped up. But easily the most successful was Pugachev. He came to Uralsk saying that actually he was Peter, and Peter had never been killed, but was just imprisoned. He begged the people of Uralsk for help in taking back the throne. Today in the city, there's a museum where Pugachev's father-in-law lived, and you can go here and learn more about this fascinating soap opera. Back then, Uralsk was called Yaitsk, and it was inhabited by Yaitsk Cossacks. If Pugachev plays the main role in this drama, then the Cossacks are the supporting players. Cossacks were a kind of warrior caste in Russian society, and they often fought for the emperor. When Pugachev came to Uralsk and convinced the Yaitsk battalion that he was there to take back the throne from the queen, they agreed. All of a sudden, this town in what is now Western Kazakhstan had its own emperor. And in the museum, you can see the throne where they say that Emelian Pugachev once presided. Now that he was king, Pugachev started what they call the Peasants' Rebellion against Catherine the Great. He found plenty of local help, both with the Yaitsk Cossacks and the nomadic Kazakhs, who both were not very happy with the taxes that she levied on their biggest livelihood, fish. But Catherine the Great put up a great defense, and in the museum you can see mittens that they say she gave to local Kazakhs who decided to stay on her side. For a couple of years, Pugachev and his Cossack supporters had some luck. They even invaded and took over a major Russian city, Kazan. But in the end, Catherine the Great won the day, and she seized the imposter, put him in a cage, dragged him to Moscow, where he was tortured, beheaded, and drawn and quartered before a large crowd. Though Pugachev's rebellion might seem like a failure, local Cossacks didn't necessarily feel as if they had been fooled. After all, they had just been fighting for their right to be heard. To this day, the Cossacks are widely respected for this toughness, and they remain a major part of Uralsk culture. In a yard behind the museum, there's this great space where you can see baskets and boats and barrels and other items from their unique way of life. Now, of course, this whole Pugachev affair was the definition of memorable, with its intrigue and its violence. But Catherine the Great was still the leader, and she didn't really want it this way, so she made a decision. Yaitsk would be renamed to Uralsk, after the nearby mountains. And one of the first visitors to this newly christened town of Uralsk was who is now the national poet of Russia, Alexander Pushkin. It's interesting that Pushkin is so widely worshipped in this part of the world, but he's relatively unknown in the West. And he really has a fascinating biography. I mean, for example, his great-grandfather was actually a slave who was brought from Africa to serve in the Russian imperial court, which means he's 1/8 black, despite being the Russian national poet. But besides all that, I mean, his poetry was brilliant, and so were his books. One of them, which is the most famous, is called The Captain's Daughter. This is based on the account of Pugachev's war, and Pushkin decided to come to Uralsk, this newly founded village, to come see what the story was all about. And he just spent 3 days in the town, but since then, he's become something like the patron saint of the city. When Pushkin came for his short stay in September of 1833, he stayed in a house that is now called the House of the Ataman. An Ataman is a kind of leader of Cossack people, and the Ataman of the time had his house built just a few years before Pushkin came by an Italian architect named Demenido. The building itself is quite impressive, and over the years, other literary figures such as Taras Shevchenko from Ukraine and the famous Lev Tolstoy also stayed here. Nowadays, it's the home to a Pushkin museum, where we can go and learn a little bit about this famous writer from an Uralskian perspective. One of the neat things that you'll learn when you come to Uralsk Pushkin Museum is that they let you play dress up. So they actually have something that approximates what Pushkin would have worn back in the day, like this black frock. You can put this on, start to get in the mood to learn a little bit about the man himself. They even have a top hat and an umbrella in case it's raining. Pushkin came to Uralsk specifically to research the Pugachev rebellion, and he used this to create a historical novel called The Captain's Daughter, or Kapitanskaya Doshka. To this day, this book is one of the most widely read in Kazakhstan, and at the Pushkin Museum, you can see some early editions of the book and some of the notes that Pushkin himself used to prepare this famous work. The story's hero is Pyotr, who fights a duel for the heart of his military commander's daughter, Masha. Woven through this classically Russian love story are the events of Pugachev's rebellion, with the fictional Pyotr even meeting the famous man and witnessing his execution. In the interest of historical recreation, the owners of the museum might even let you sit down at a table and a stool much like Pushkin himself would have used 200 years ago. And you can use the feather and paper that they have to try to think up a masterpiece of your own. One of the strangest exhibits at the museum has to be the death mask of Pushkin. When the poet died at just the age of 38, his face was embalmed in plaster. And using this, they made this kind of model. You can look at it, look in the poet's face, and ask him, what kind of secrets do you have? It's certainly no secret that Kazakhs to this day still love Pushkin. If you talk to almost anybody on the street, they can recite for you some of his poetry. But what not a lot of people know is that actually Pushkin loved Kazakhs. He loved Kazakh culture and Kazakh poetry especially. When scholars looked through his archives, they found 5 handwritten pages, a transcription of an original Kazakh myth called Kozy Kurpesh and Bayan Solu. It turns out that Pushkin might have done a lot to popularize this piece in Kazakhstan. To this day, it's one of the most famous Kazakh stories, seen in film, in theater, and in the opera. I'm sure that Pushkin, being such a scholar of Pugachev and his Cossack rebellion, would have found this place fascinating. We're in the People's Museum of Old Uralsk, where one man has collected all of these things from citizens of the city to show off the history that this place has. They have small exhibits on the Russian poet, on Pugachev, and on Cossack life in general. The Old Uralsk Museum is actually a great place to learn about Cossack music, which has been passed down through the generations ever since the time of Pushkin and Pugachev. They have a very beautiful polyphonic singing tradition, where they talk about warriors of the past and of great rides into battle. And at the museum, they have a record here, which even has an English title, "'Tis Not One Cossack Was on the Spree." You can listen to it and imagine what these warriors would have thought when they were fighting against the Tsar. To this day, Cossacks in Uralsk have kept up this musical tradition, and at their cultural center, they broke out their accordions and sabers, beaming with pride as they showed us how to dance and sing with gusto. But of course, Cossacks weren't just singers, they were mostly fighters. And in one corner of the People's Museum here in Uralsk, you can learn a little bit about their military conquests. They have all these great historical photos from their travels throughout Central Asia, invading this place on behalf of the Russian Empire. They have these really interesting little comics that they make. When one soldier would be released from the army, he would get this as a keepsake. There's a little cartoon of a horse, and they would cut and paste his head right in there as a keepsake. In this little section, we have all these medals and swords and different military paraphernalia. But perhaps my most favorite thing here that we found was this, called a papacha. This is a kind of sheep fur hat that would be worn by different Cossacks, but only the white fur could be worn by the Ottoman, who was the head of the Cossacks. So, what do you think? How do I look?